Hello, this is Professor Gavoor. Today we're going to cover Learning Block 4 in the online text for operations management, and we're moving into this area of inventory. So we're going to talk about the basic overview of inventory and how to manage it and its overall role in supply chain management. We're going to talk about the types of inventory because there's more than one type, and cost factors involved, and the benefits of good inventory management practices, and also to talk about where the inventory is located, the people that manage it, and etc. The more mathematical parts of inventory management will be covered from the old textbook chapter on inventory management. So the objectives here are to differentiate between fixed variable costs and direct and indirect costs, describe 4 types of inventory, and maybe more, list several key performance indicators used for successful inventory management, understand what inventory turns are and days coverage, and differentiate between inventory and inventory management. So what is inventory? Inventory is when you store goods that aren't for immediate use, for some future date. That's basically what inventory is. And it's all goods that are held for selling or performing daily tasks or manufacturing or assembling or whatever that may be involved. There's a monetary investment. You use up cash to buy inventory. Or if you produce finished goods and hold that inventory, you've used up cash to buy the raw and pack inventory that are then used to transformed into finished goods, and so as inventory goes up, cash tends to go down. It's hard to measure it exactly because it's not a one-to-one relationship, because cash goes up and down for very many other reasons, which we'll talk about a little bit. So here's some exposures from having too much inventory or carrying inventory at all. The product could become obsolete. If you have too many iPhone 4s in your inventory, they're worthless now because people are buying iPhone 10s and 11s and whatnot. You could have spoilage if you're in a grocery business, and produce, eggs, things of that nature have a definite shelf life, and if you allow that to happen, if you allow it to spoil, the value of your cash that you invested in that inventory is just gone. You have to throw it away. There's no other choice. Damage and theft. Anything sitting around, nothing good happens to it unless it's wine or cognac in a barrel that ages, or whiskey, and improves with age. Most other products don't improve with age, and the product can be misplaced, it can get damaged, it could be stolen. And then there's seasonality. Think of department stores. Most department stores don't have back rooms much anymore. All their inventory is on the shelves and out on the store. So to make room for, if they order too much clothes in the fall and winter, they have to have a fire sale to get rid of those clothes to make room for the spring-summer fashions. And if they order too much in spring and summer, they have to do the same in August to make room for the fall-winter collection for the next year. So inventory is an asset which is either consumed within your factory or sold to consumers and customers. So when we look at the extent to any asset that can be converted to cash, is actually a measure of that asset liquidity. Inventory management is basically the management process used to efficiently oversee how you're building and use and balancing of inventory. So when we talk about inventory management, inventory control, we want to know where all our stuff is. If I have, and let's look at finished goods here right now. The same applies to raw and pack. If I have 1,000 finished good inventory items, I want to know where all of that stuff is. I might have a warehouse the size of a football field. Where do I put it? How do I make sure I know where it is? How do I make sure it's visible to me in the system and easily found in the warehouse itself? How do I protect that inventory? How do I account for the movements thereof? I want to control the cost to minimize the expenses. The more inventory, the higher the cost. If I fill up my warehouse and have to rent additional space, that's usually a sign of poor management or poor sales or whatever. That's an extra expense. So I have to interface with procurement and inbound logistics. In other words, the goods, the raw and packed materials that are coming in to my system to monitor the availability of inventory that has been ordered for future. So I want to know what I have, what's on its way to me, what I think customers are going to want to buy in the future. And this whole thing is rooted and tied to forecasting that we've already talked about. So we have to look at this long range, mid range, and certainly day to day, and includes the value of the inventory, how old it is, if there's any deterioration or depreciation. I want to optimize the inventory that I have because remember, I want to have the right products in the right place at the right time in the right quantities so that I can maximize my customer service, minimize my cost, etc. And then I want a return on investment of that inventory. So if you look at this picture, you have stock in. And what happens? You have metrics, you know, this is not the best picture in the world, but they're really, I don't know if there's a flow to this or not, but these are all the parts you want to look at. Are things in stock? Are things out of stock? They come into stock by production or ordering. They go out of stock by either using them or selling them. You want to make sure that you keep track of where everything is, so you have physical counts. There's always going to be discrepancies between the physical count and the actual theoretical amount, which is what's in the system. I have 100 of these items, you go, there's only 95. I have 100 of these items, you go, there's 102. Where did the extra 2 come from? Usually you have less than or equal to what you think you have, not very often do you have more. You transfer stocks and deploy things. Things expire or become obsolete. What do you do with that kind of inventory? And you want to minimize the amount that happens. And to keep track of all of this stuff, you want to have some reporting and analysis. You may get returns from the stock out. Customers return things, and you've got to actually spend time putting it back into stock. And you want metrics that keep track of how all of this is operating. So you want to balance risk and stock outs. Stock out, no inventory is available to sell. Again, we're talking finished goods inventory. This really upsets C-level executives and really upsets salespeople. If they go through the trouble of selling something and as an operations manager, you do not have it in stock, they're all over you. And all of a sudden, everybody's an expert in planning and inventory management and forecasting, and you don't know anything. But they really get upset if they sell something and you are not able to fill it. On the other hand, if you have too much inventory because things aren't selling and you built it in anticipation of a sale, well, then you have a different issue. And that's slower to get the attention of management, of the C-level executives, and it's often the CFO that first picks up on it because they're looking at the amount of cash and versus how much we have in inventory. And all of a sudden they realize, oh my God, we have so much inventory. What are we going to do? All of a sudden they become experts in, again, forecasting, planning, production control, etc. And one way to get their attention, as we mentioned before, is go and ask for permission to rent outside space to cover all the excess or leftover inventory you have. It would be nice that if you go into a grocery store and if someone buys a box of Cheerios, the Cheerio factory of General Mills is notified immediately that the Jewel in Skokie on this road, at this address, just sold a box of Cheerios. Please make another box and send it to them. it doesn't happen that way. And most of the time with fast moving consumer goods like we're talking about here, they make boxes of Cheerios in anticipation of the next month's sales. So organizations need the raw and packing materials or component sub-finished goods to manufacture the actual goods that you'll sell to the customer. If you have too much inventory, there's consequences. Your warehousing costs go up. If your warehouse is full, your productivity in the warehouse goes down. You have labor tending to all of this and putting things away, and the more full the warehouse is, the harder that job is, and usually more labor is required. You might risk expiration or obsolescence. Expiration means it's past its usage date. Obsolescence means we're no longer even offering that product and it's not for sale. Product that's old, that's been in the warehouse too long, is considered slow moving. Obsolescence is obsolete. So SL from slow and OB from obsolete is slob, SLOB. Or excess and obsolete, E and O. People call it both. The amount of that percentage of that inventory is a measure people look at very, very seriously. If I've seen companies where the slob, I like that because it sounds slovenly and not well managed. If it exceeds 30%, you've consumed, you might as well brick up part of your warehouse because you have goods stored in storage locations that are unable to be sold and not moving at all. So you've basically taken the throughput of your warehouse and cut it down by 30%. We talked about theft, or what they call shrinkage. Shrinkage means we thought there was 100, now there's only 90. Where did the other 10 go? It shrank. And shrinkage could be many things. It could be misplaced. It could have been damaged and thrown away. It could have been stolen. You have insurance issues. You could have, if you damage the product, that's a loss. And then actually, there's a carrying cost. Everything that sits in your warehouse pays rent. There's a cost of that running that warehouse for a whole year. And if I've got something sitting in that warehouse, the amount of space it takes up, it has to pay rent for that space. So you allocate your costs to the average inventory, and you have what's called holding costs. And that could be substantial, especially if you have a lot of slow and obsolete product that never move. These products are taking up, absorbing all of that cost without any of the throughput. Okay. Inventory costs. Well, certainly you have the cost of the item purchased, or the baseline cost. So if I'm buying a component to make a pen, let's say a plastic component, let's say the refill, make it easy. And that refill costs me 15 cents every time I order one. There's that cost. Then I have to consider the warehousing costs, receiving, picking, etc., labor, risk of expiration or obsolete that requires disposal, damage, all of this kind of stuff. And then when the merchandise arrives, you have to pay, store it, move it, insure it. All of these costs can come into the rent that product pays while it's in inventory. The other thing is there's two other kind of costs we have. We have carrying costs and we have procurement costs. The procurement cost could be one of two things. I mean, generally, if you know that you have to buy 50,000, if you're going to make 50,000 of a certain pen and you're buying refills, and they're 15 cents each, you're going to have to. That cost is almost a sunk cost. You have to take 50,000 times 15 cents per refill, multiply that out, and that's the amount that you're going to have to pay for the goods. The question now is, how often do you order it? And what is the ordering cost, and how much of it is in inventory, and what's the holding cost? So if you look at here, you have the procurement cost and you have the carrying cost. The carrying cost is linear because it really has to do with the amount of average inventory you have and how much you're going to pay on a monthly or annual basis. The procurement cost, it depends on how much you're buying and how often you're ordering. So, and why do you think there's a cost for ordering? Well, if you're ordering for something from Amazon, it takes seconds, right? But it's still, if you're being paid $75,000 a year, half a minute or 2 minutes or even 15 minutes of your time is a non-zero cost to place the order. Then you have the transactional costs involved as well. Think about something else. Who has ever tried to book a flight on an airline? And you start shopping around, you're trying to find the lowest price, you're trying to do this. All of a sudden, your ordering cost for one airline ticket to go from Chicago to New York takes you an hour, and maybe you get frustrated and stop that day and start the next day, and it takes another hour, and then I found a great deal, let's take this. If you're lucky, it takes no time. If you're not lucky, and you're really searching around the web, all different websites and airline websites and travel company websites, it could take you a long time. So, inventory costs. You have the cost to order, maintain, and hold inventory, as well to administer the related paperwork. So, the cost of an item specified in a purchase order is a baseline cost or purchased item cost. And then we talked about when it arrives, then move it, insure it, process it, store it. So that's the holding cost. The rent that the product has to pay for being in your warehouse. And then the activity costs are divided into indirect and direct costs that are broken down into whether the expenses are fixed or variable. That's probably at a higher level than we'll look at. And then you want to minimize your total inventory costs. You want to reduce the amount of ordering or purchase capital, ordering costs, and interest if you're borrowing on it. You want to minimize the warehousing and transportation costs. You want to minimize the depreciation and insurance and taxes. You want to definitely minimize the obsolescence and the shrinkage and damage costs you want to also minimize. But this picture tells it most. We have an ordering cost and we have a carrying cost. We'll do most of our calculations based on these two things. So the acquisition costs. The purchase item cost to identify the supplier, R&D, because sometimes when you're buying raw and packed materials, you have to do some research and development to decide what it is you want to buy. You have to negotiate with the suppliers. This can take a long time. Management of the purchasing process. You have to actually draw up the contract, have it signed. That's part of negotiation. You want to track and expedite your orders. Expediting adds cost because you're usually paying for a faster mode of transportation. If you're normally getting it by truck or boat, you're all of a sudden getting it by air, and that costs a lot more. So that's involved in movement, transportation. You want to process your purchasing and the payment. And then you have a Forex, the foreign exchange, taxes, duties, any of those things that might be involved. Customs, brokerage fees, port costs, all of these things add up to the acquisition of raw and packaging materials. Your indirect and direct costs. So they can be direct or indirect. They can be fixed, variable, or semi-variable. So direct costs are during manufacturing, raw materials, equipment, and labor to run equipment. You're measuring it, you're looking at it. Indirect costs that are part of the rent that the product must pay while it's in your warehouse and factory is used for the manufacturing but not directly related to the manufacturing function. So we're talking about supervision, management, HR, finance, departments that all reside in those buildings, the utilities and fixed costs of that building itself. So all of those are indirect costs. So you have materials and labor are direct costs, and then all the fixed costs of a building and the administration of that building go into the cost here of a bicycle. So cost of goods sold if you recall from financial accounting, is basically the accumulation of all the expenses involved in purchasing the inventory. It's your starting inventory plus purchases, minus the purchase returns and allowances that you send back to the suppliers, any discount that you get because maybe you've negotiated well, the freight that you pay to get that in, whether it's included in the price or not, and minus your ending inventory, and that becomes your cost of goods sold. And we know that sales minus cost of goods sold is called gross revenue or gross profit. It's not the final profit yet because there's a lot of other costs that have to be taken out. But if we have revenue, which is sales, minus cost of goods sold, that becomes gross profit. So there are 4 types of inventory. Raw materials, which I call raw and packed materials, and it could include semi-finished goods, like a hard drive is a raw material for a computer, but it's also a semi-finished good. Packing materials would be like the boxes and styrofoam that they use to pack the computer in and for shipping. The cryovac wrap that goes around the box, perhaps, and other things. That would be packaging materials. Our raw materials might be pellets that are used to make the plastic case of this or that, or the various components could be raw materials as well, or considered semi-finished goods. Finished goods are when you're done with all your manufacturing. You've taken all these component, raw, pack, and semi-finished goods, and you add value to them by either processing them further or assembling them into what's called a finished good that's now for sale. A finished good is something that's ready to sell to a customer or consumer, and it has higher value than all the components that go into it because of your intellectual ability to build something of higher value from these various parts. In between, you have work in process. There's a distinct delineation of when something is considered a raw material. When it's a raw material, it's in a raw material warehouse. Whether you're managing that inventory or it's managed by your vendor on site for you, is all in everything in that warehouse that's the raw and pack warehouse is considered a raw material. It does not become work in process until it is transferred from that warehouse, and it's actually a computer transaction in an ERP system that releases that product into the hands of the factory. Now we say, okay, we had all of this product. I'm just debiting it out of my warehouse, and I'm adding it, crediting it to the account of the factory. Because accountants really want to know where this stuff is. They want to minimize the shrinkage. They want to account for every dollar of inventory you have, no matter what kind it is. Now, once it's transacted into the factory, everything in a factory is considered work in process. There's, on one end of the factory, there's certainly finished goods that have just come through the door from the raw and pack warehouse, which may actually be attached to the factory or it could be separate, in which case there's transit involved. And the transit costs are probably part of the work in process, depending on how they account for that. When it comes into the factory, the nuts, the bolts, everything that you talk about, the pellets, the hard drives, the graphic cards are all considered work in process now. Even when they're in the midst of assembly, it is definitely work in process because you're assembling the computer. But when even it's done and it's finished as a finished good, all packaged, palletized, ready to ship to customers, it's still considered work in process because it's in a factory. It's not until those goods are released and transferred in the ERP system again to the finished goods warehouse that they're actually no longer called work in process and now are called finished goods. When it's classified as finished goods, it means it's in a finished goods warehouse and available to be sold and delivered. Now you have these other MRO kinds of things. Not directly consumed in manufacturing, but it's in the support of manufacturing. Grease for the conveyor, nuts and bolts oftentimes come here. Pencils, pens, stationery, all of that kind of stuff is part of what they call maintenance, repair, and operating kind of inventory. Now, they don't talk about slow and obsolete inventory at all here, but I think in every organization I ever worked in, we definitely call that a class of inventory because it's inventory that's in your finished goods warehouse that you just don't sell. It's like cholesterol in your finished goods warehouse. So each type of inventory requires different elements of planning and inventory control. But they're all related because your end goal is how many finished goods do I want? And you go backwards from there. How much do I need work in process? When am I scheduling the production and assembly of those finished goods? And then what raw materials do I have to have in the right place at the right time in the right quantities to meet that production schedule, to have the right quantities of finished goods in the right place at the right time to sell to customers. So the planning is all related. So raw materials, we talked about parts, components, semi-processed goods, catalysts, commodities, critical components, and all the packaging. I tend to not just call it raw, I call it raw and pack. So these are the materials that you put into your system. Like here, if you look at your building, some sort of transfer case or transmission, you need shafts and gears and all these things that are going to be built up into a finished transmission if that's what you sell. You may have raw eggs coming in. That could be your raw material. They're not. It's work in process. They come in raw eggs into your staging area. When you transfer it to the processing center, all the raw eggs may be done is just sorted and put into cartons, and then the cartons are packed and palletized to ship to various stores. That's a work in process, and when it's released to the finished good warehouse, which hopefully is refrigerated, the whole thing should be refrigerated so the eggs don't spoil, then it gets transferred to finished goods. Same thing with produce. There's fruit processing. You have apples. Apples come in a store. Until you bag them or crate them or put them in the cartons or wrap them in gold tin foil, depending on what you do, that's all. You still have raw pack inventory. You have work in process, then you have finished goods. So WIP and MRO and fabrication waste. So work in process, inventory that has been moved and staged for manufacturing. Now work in process is reduced as it's consumed to make finished goods, but in the factory it's all considered work in process. Now, you have a value of inventory coming in. You have a value of finished goods inventory going out, which should be greater than. If it's not greater than, you're going to lose money. And then you have some scrap that comes, which is called fabrication waste. If I have cloth and I'm cutting out T-shirts, well, no matter how hard I try and make the puzzle pieces of all the T-shirt fronts and backs, so I use up as much of the fabric as I possibly can, there's always going to be leftover fabric, and that's considered a waste. Same thing if I take sheet metal and stamp other parts out of it. There's always going to be bits of metal, bits of plastic, things that are left over. And it cannot be converted into value immediately. You might recycle some of it, like leftover plastic can be reground and introduced back into the raw material, but you don't want to use too much regrind, especially if it's a lustrous plastic piece. Regrind tends to make things, it's not as good as virgin plastic pellets, if you will. Products come out cloudier and they don't look as nice. MRO is the products that you need to consume, as we said. What do we call it? Materials repair and operating. Those are the nuts and bolts and things that you have in the factory: the wrenches, the tools, the work gloves, all that kind of stuff that you need. The earplugs for the workers, the hard hats, the everything that is not essential to manufacturing, but things that the factory has to buy to support production. And finished good, well, that's the saleable item. And remember, it's not saleable until it's transferred out of work in process. So the saleable item, it's a component in future manufacturing process or service part. Some items may be all three: product sold to a consumer, used in another product, and also used as a service part. Finished goods are sometimes unsellable. We have obsolete, no longer of value. They could be rejected for quality purposes, which means they either require reworking or scrapping. Most people don't like to scrap things right away. They accumulate it until it becomes a mountain of scrap, and then it costs a lot of money to do. You might get returns from merchandise brought back from customers requiring inspection, rework, or oftentimes just scrapping. Depends on the kind of product that you have. If you have something like a toothpaste that's on, you have to hold it for so many days before you can release it for quality purposes to make sure you're not growing any bugs in it. It requires a holding period to determine if the quality has been maintained. That finished good is not sellable, but you're counting on it being saleable. Lead time. Well, how long does it take you to get each raw and packed material in? The longer it takes you, the higher your inventory levels have to be. If you order something from overseas, whether it's finished iPhones, as Apple would do, or clothes, as many department stores and clothing manufacturers might do, or even a component that goes in a computer that you assemble here, or other raw material that you might get. If it's coming from China, you got to figure 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. 1/3 of your inventory or your potential inventory is in production in China. 1/3 of it is on the water, and 1/3 of it is in your possession here. So you're basically, and if each thing takes a month, it takes a month to produce. We're in February, we're producing now, or March now. We're producing in March to ship in April to consume in May. Consumer sell in May. So it's that 1/3. It's 1/3 of a month in production, 1/3 of a month on the water, 1/3 of your inventory is in usable goods in your own hands. So you've got 3 months of inventory, and you can only use 1 month of it at any time, but you've got this process happening. So when you have the lead time like this, you've got to decide what your reorder point is on your finished goods. And sometimes you're ordering it while you have a lot of inventory, but you're anticipating selling it, and you're still placing an order for the next 2 months down the line. So as we said here, long lead times usually demand higher inventory levels to ensure manufacturing operations and customer orders are not adversely impacted by stockouts. That's basically it. So if we look at this reorder point, this is things that are ordered very, very nicely. And notice that you have, if it takes me this much time, if this is time down here, and we have the stock level, we order a certain amount of stock. We begin drawing down on this stock. It usually, this is a very nice picture. It usually doesn't happen as smoothly and as linearly as this, but it's a good model to have. When you get to a certain point, based on the lead time, it says, I've reached my point where I better order some, or what? Or I'm going to run out. I don't have enough time. I'll run out before the product comes. If the product comes here, you've waited too long. If you wait till here to order it, you're going to be out of stock. So let's figure out what this reorder point is based on lead time and daily demand and etc. We'll place an order, and then as we're drawing down the stock, theoretically when we get to 0, the new batch will arrive, and then we begin drawing it down again. And this difference between the reorder point and 0 is called safety stock. Okay, so the reorder point must be accurately defined to ensure there's sufficient stock. Now, the lead time can have variation around it. The transit time could have variation around it. So all of a sudden, this could be random variables that you're dealing with, and all of a sudden all your statistical skills have to come into place. Usually it's a normal distribution that we're talking about, and it's, if you recall your statistics, it's relatively predictable. Okay, so lead time, longer lead time. Based on historical demand, planner identifies the need for inventory in week 12. So this is week 1. And this is like looking forward, right? The buyer writes a PO and sends it to the supplier. Supplier responds with confirmation. The buyer approves any changes. The supplier orders raw materials that they need to make your raw materials. So the supplier then waits for their raw materials if they don't have it in stock. That could be shorter if they're carrying inventory in anticipation for your build. But if not, they have to wait for it to arrive. So the planner identifies pending shortage and places additional orders. And this is the planner usually of the supplier. Raw materials and parts delivered to the manufacturing begins. When manufacturing is done, it's in transit to the port, and it doesn't go right on the ship. It waits until the ship is not loaded instantaneously. All these containers pile up until all the containers that are going to go on the ship are there, and then they load the containers when the ship comes in. Then it's on the water for X number of weeks. So, if we're talking, and the way they've drawn it here, it's like, what are they talking about here? Weeks. So 16, 17, 18 weeks. Let's say 20 weeks is going to be 4 months. So this is a little longer than I used to use my 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. So usually I'm thinking this part here, the raw materials and manufacturing takes a month. It takes a month on the water. So it should only really take 2 months. It should take 8 weeks to do this. And that seems to be the kind of rule of thumb in consumer goods as far as my experience has led me to believe. So it's on the water, it goes to the port, wherever the port may be. In this case, they're saying Memphis. And it's not unloaded immediately and shipped to you. It takes a while to unload a container ship, and it sits in the yard until your trucking company comes and it clears customs and blah, 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 blah. Then it's put on a truck and sent to you, and now you can use it. Now there's 2 other concepts here called just-in-time and lean. Just-in-time means that, and let's start with just-in-time first. The company receives the raw materials just as they're needed for manufacturing. Ford and GM have gotten very, very good at this. They have all their suppliers kind of close by to them, and this is something they learned from Toyota and the Japanese. So that when we're building cars, or they're building cars for tomorrow, they will get all the seats for the build tomorrow, all the interior trim panels, all the steering wheels, the tires from all their suppliers, even the glass, and it's all sequenced in the order they're going to build it. Glass may not matter so much if you're building all Mustangs, but the seats will if you have cloth seats, leather seats, this color seat, that color seat, and whatever the order is. So they've created racks on wheels that contain the next day's production. They deliver it either late the night before or early the morning before the production run is going to start. And it's all sequenced in the order they're going to build the car. That's just in time at its best. So you can eliminate or dramatically reduce the raw material and warehousing and holding costs. What you've actually done is transfer those costs to your suppliers, or some of those costs, and then put the burden on them to then try to do the same with their suppliers. So eventually you will have some reduction in the overall cost, and you'll be able to plan much better. So it eliminates the task of moving materials to storage and later retrieval of the same. So a lot of Ford and General Motors assembly plants don't have a lot of storage for raw and packed materials. It's probably minimal because most of their value of their goods are being delivered just in time. Now, if your suppliers aren't close, you move to something called lean. So it's operational and procedural practices that create efficient flow and take as much time out of the system as it can. If this is not necessarily just in time in this picture from the previous slide, but if I authorize this manufacturer to carry raw materials, I can take, basically 4 weeks out of the system if I authorize them to carry raw materials for me. And usually the authorization means if I decide I stop using them, those raw materials I've got to pay for. But as long as you have a good relationship, so I could eliminate this time and move everything down 4 weeks. If it takes me, what do they have here? It goes from 6.5 to 11. That looks like 4.5 months of manufacturing, or 4.5 weeks of manufacturing. Maybe if I can cut that down to 2 or 3. If I also authorize them to carry finished goods and build to stock in anticipation of my sales, well, then I can just order from them. I could eliminate all this time and not negotiate every time I'm doing it, but just place a purchase order. All of a sudden, I could only have this time to get my goods. But that all has to be negotiated. That's lean. Trying to take as much time as you can out of the system to get the most efficient flow of goods. It's not just in time, but it's really close. Okay. So there's also another things that you want to do. This lean methodology. And actually in this chapter, we don't have a separate chapter on quality. The LINC group that does these slides in this book that we're using online, they're covering quality kind of here. So the old book chapters that go along with this will be the chapter on quality management, and it will be the chapter on inventory management. So the Japanese always talk about the 5 S's. And there are 5 Japanese words that they've actually found English words all starting in S to go along with it. So it's sort. Keep only necessary items in a workplace. Like if you took a picture of my desk right now, it's cluttered with papers and CDs and pens and this and that. They would hey, sort the living daylights out of this and get rid of stuff. When in doubt, move it out. Red tag technique. So, clean your workplace. Set everything in order. You see if you think about people that have unorganized workbenches where their tools are all over the place, and people that have everything's in its place and hanging up right where that will save a lot of time and effort in finding the right tool that you need. I saw in Japanese factories, if you open a desk drawer, there was a foam insert that had a place for 1 pen, 2 pencils, a ruler, and a pair of scissors and a stapler, and that's all that was deemed that you were supposed to have. And maybe a pad of paper on your desk and your computer. Shine. Clean the work area so it's neat and tidy. If I was going to make one judgment of a factory by just a quick walkthrough on how well the operation is being managed, and I only had 30 seconds to do it, it would be this tidiness, this cleanliness, this shine. Because people do that last. I could be a really effective professor and I could have papers and junk all over the place. It would be hard for me to organize everything and be a bad professor at the same time. Usually, if I'm a bad professor, I'm probably already not paying attention to my mess and my clutter unless I just throw away everything that comes in, including your exams. But usually people tend not to be clean and ineffective. They tend to be effective, and cleanliness is the last step of that. You want to standardize, so you want to make up the rules and follow and enforce them, so you have standard operating processes. And you want to maintain this, sustain this, so it becomes a habit and a way of doing work. I'm still at the age of whatever I am here, trying to master all of this in my own personal workspaces. So they talk about quality assurance management. So this is part of lean, but it's also part of quality. And if you look at the Japanese way, there's 3 ways of looking at quality. You can look at quality management in its own right as quality. You could look at preventive maintenance, and this 5F methodology is part of preventive maintenance to keep your factory running at peak order and efficiency all the time. And we look at this quality assurance. So it's a way of preventing mistakes or defects in manufacturing products from getting to the next step. I want to make sure that I'm producing things right the first time, and I don't have to rely on inspection, and I don't have to rely on rework, because that's all very costly. It adds money. If I do it right the first time, if I'm that gifted a writer and I can crank out a 500-page essay like that's of high quality, I don't have to go back and edit it and redo it and relook at it. No, that's not what I meant. Oh, I didn't cover that part of the assignment. That's all that rework takes a lot of time. So lean and just-in-time are essential to quality assurance management. So if quality defects getting to your customers or the next step in the process is your big problem, you lead with quality assurance, and just-in-time and lean become part of that. If you look at, if your problem is factory effectiveness and efficiency, you lead with lean and just-in-time, and quality assurance becomes subservient to that. So if you look at lean inventory management, minimize the amount of inventory on hand in order to minimize investment and carrying costs. So lean can refer to efficient flow, or you're talking about what's value-added tasks. And one of the examples they use is cross-stocking, which I think we covered in the warehousing part. Just-in-time is part of this. And you eliminate raw material holding costs, storage labor, and all of that. Inventory is, you carry inventory in a way to cover your other sins. Your variations in lead time, your variation in ability to produce, your variation in producing good products versus defective products. So if I can reduce the variation in lead times, if I can reduce the variation in production times, if I can reduce the variation in setup times, if I can reduce the variation in the amount of poor quality that I produce, I all of a sudden will be reducing the amount of inventory I have to carry, which is very cool. So here's a video you've probably watched, the 14 ways of the Toyota way. Maybe we'll have a discussion or exam question on that. I have to write it down to remember that. Okay. So now, one of the things that they talk about in quality assurance is quality improvement, process improvement / problem solving. And this is all, we'll have more on this later, but it's based on a scientific method. Remember that from 5th grade? I have a hypothesis, design an experiment, collect some data, see if your hypothesis was true, and then you have a predictive model to use moving forward. Well, this is the same thing, except we define a hypothesis. Why is my quality bad? Collect some data, verify the root cause of what you think is your bad quality, then fix it, collect some more data and see if it fixed it, and then move forward. So it's a scientific method applied to industrial problem solving, industrial process improvement, industrial quality improvement. And one of the big ways of doing this, there's so many different ways, 4-step method, 5-step methods, 6-step methods. One of the popular ways is something called 6 Sigma, which we'll talk about later. And it involves define, measure, analyze, improve, control. So it's kind of like that scientific method. And it's 5 steps. And DMAIC is pronounced DMAIC. The acronym for their process is called that. The quality gurus of Schuhart and Deming call it Plan, Do, Check, Act. Other people have a 7-step method. Ishikawa, I believe, had a 7-step method. And these names will become familiar to you as we cover quality. So supplier managed and third-party systems. Maybe it's better that I don't own my own inventory, the raw and packed inventory in my warehouse, and I eliminate the supplier warehouse by just having them ship everything that they produce to my warehouse. And even though it's not just in time, they would manage that inventory in my warehouse, and we would be in constant communication of my production plans, and then they would try to minimize that inventory since it's still on their books, but still satisfying my needs. So that's supplier managed or vendor managed inventories. People agree up front on inventory levels, pricing, etc. Suppliers are responsible for monitoring and replenishing inventory as needed. An example of the supplier managed inventory is you go to any gas station that has Frito-Lay products in their food store. They don't control that inventory. Frito-Lay controls that inventory. So it's vendor managed. I don't know who owns the inventory when it's in the store. That is a different issue. But Frito-Lay actually takes that rack of Frito-Lay products and they manage what goes in the store. And they know store by store, almost selling location by selling location, hey, 4th of July is coming up. This store sells a lot more. We're going to carry a lot more potato chips and this and that and whatever that people are going to use on 4th of July. Oh, Christmas is coming up. This store sells a lot more there. Probably the flow of goods through a gas station store is probably less than a grocery store in the variation by various holidays, but Frito-Lay managed that inventory, not necessarily because the gas station wants them to, because they know that if they manage it and provide that service themselves to the gas station, they're going to do it better and they have better data than the gas station actually has. And therefore can make sure that their products are always available to consumers that always want them, no matter what day of the year and what impending holiday is coming up. The other thing you can do is what Apple does, is what's called contract manufacturing. They don't make any iPhones. Everything is done by Foxconn in Taiwan and China, which is their contract manufacturer or their major league business partner. The other one, so you could do contract manufacturing. The other one is customer inventory control. Customers manage inventory, raw materials, finished goods. Ford may want to do that when they look at some of their suppliers. They might want to say, here's our production. We can provide you with a materials resource plan that says when you need to have your materials in to support our production. That could happen. I don't see that as much because most people have sophisticated ERP systems now that if my system talks to your system and your system is properly configured, it can take my demand needs and translate them into your demand needs and the demand needs you need from your suppliers. So I think it's more done that way now. And the benefits are financial, lead times, and guaranteed supply. That's really what we want to have. We don't want to go out of stock. And we want to make sure that everything that we make, we sell. Those are two different things, but we want to make sure both. So, in order for these kinds of partnerships to happen, the partnership only works as good as the lowest common denominator. And by this I mean, if I have two parties and one wants to really be partnered, really wants to share data, really wants to be open and communicative, and the other doesn't want to be, and I don't care who's the supplier and who's the customer, it's only going to operate at that lower level. If my supplier wants to really communicate more with me and partner more and share information, and I don't want to, it's going to go down to my level of partnership. If I really want to do more and I don't have the leverage over my supplier to make them adhere to my level of partnership, it's going to revert to their level of partnership. So that's what we're talking about in this kind of diagram. Understanding your partner, selecting a VMI service provider, maybe if it's a third party, organize and count inventory, set order quantities, gather data, store inventory data, choose replenishment system that you're going to have, and set up an order creation. I guess that's a general way of looking at it. I'm not sold entirely on that graphic. So the last slide here is inventory management is definitely complex interplay of processes and controls. Successful inventory management helps companies succeed while also strengthening the customers and suppliers on which they depend. And by balancing inventory levels, customers provide maximum service at the lowest total cost. So you could read this, go through these slides, watch a Toyota video a little bit, and kind of an introduction to quality, and then take the quiz on Learning Block 4 on the online course. Thank you very much.